Hello, everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome and thank you for joining today's session. My name is Elena Kretschmer, and I work in Adobe's Customer Success Manager group, where we focus on helping you, our customers, get as much value as possible from your Adobe solution. Today, we're hosting the second part of the Analytics Insider webinar series, and we'll be doing a deep dive on web and mobile app analysis. This live webinar is a listen-only format, but is very much intended to be interactive. Please type your questions into the chat pod at the side of the screen at any time. The team will look to address as many questions as possible after the presentation, and will follow up with you on any others we might not get to immediately. Just to note that this session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to everyone who registered, along with a link to recordings of previous sessions in this series. We'll also have a closing poll at the end to get feedback on the usefulness of this session, as well as any suggestions you may have for further webinars. Our presenter today is Matisoff, Evangelist for Adobe Analytics, and to get things started, I'll go ahead and pass you over to him now.
Great, thank you, Elena, and welcome analysts and marketers and data scientists to our second webinar. Today the focus is going to be on mobile and web analysis. We're going to be doing a deep dive on that. And just a couple of things to be aware of. First of all, if you're looking to brush up on the latest and greatest when it has in terms of what we've released and new training guides associated with Adobe Analytics, I highly recommend heading on over to the Adobe Analytics YouTube channel. We've got I think looks like 91 videos or more that are currently live there, and it's a great way to learn what's going on within the Adobe Analytics world, as well as to engage with the Adobe Analytics product team as we actually monitor the comments, and we're happy to interact with you there. In fact, in addition to interacting with us, you can also check out the community forums with the Experience Cloud. You can access them very easily through this kind of lengthy URL that I have on the slide, or more easily by clicking the question mark when you're logged into Adobe Analytics or really any Experience Cloud solution, and sliding on down to Community. It's a great way to interact, again, with other Adobe customers like yourself, as well as the product team, and we even have folks that are specifically monitoring that to make sure that any questions that are asked are answered, any discussions that are going on are provided the love that they need, and it's a great way to stay in touch. In fact, we're creating a thread specific to this webinar, so if you have questions that don't get answered in the Q&A, that's going on through the chat pod or at the end, or if there's a follow-up that you're curious about, it's a great way to stay in touch with the topics that we're discussing today. So speaking of those topics, let's talk about mobile and web and do a little bit of a deep dive. So you probably are not surprised to recognize that customers are engaging with brands in a slew of new ways, whether that's just simply researching online on the web or in an app, or going to YouTube or elsewhere to view videos of newer products, mobile advertising, Facebook, product updates, etc. And what that means is that consumers see your brand as a single thing. It's just one brand, but marketers have all of these different ways to actually interact with the consumers that are interacting with the brand, whether it's across TV, your computers, phones, in-store, car, and more. And then there's all of these different channels across those different screens, the web, in-store, email, search, call center, apps. And I know that when I'm researching a product, it oftentimes, will look extremely different from how the next person is actually interacting with a brand, and in essence, that means that no two customer journeys are exactly the same. So what does that mean in terms of data? Well, for Adobe customers, we're very much recognizing the need to build a single customer view in order to recognize and analyze and activate based on that customer journey. We can see here that companies are really concerned about merging profile fragments as the data becomes available, collecting data across channels, and that could be all those different channels that I was just talking about, and more. So what we've recognized, and this will come as a surprise to no one, is that the number of connected devices is increasing in a ridiculous amount. Something happened, right around 2008 that caused a pretty significant increase in the number of connected devices, and we're, according to Cisco, expecting 50 billion connected devices by 2020. What I love about this graph that I was just noticing is that in 2015, the only way that we were able to get to 18.2 billion was thanks to, a connected toothbrush. So that's, if you don't have a connected toothbrush, I don't know what you're waiting for. Anyway, across all of those different channels, there's a wealth of data to be collected. And customers are asking questions like, how do they quantify the value of the touch points and business opportunities? How do you take the data that's collected from voice around products and intent and the errors that are being collected and merge it with data being collected from mobile and mobile apps and the mobile web as well as desktop and even the connected car? And we're thinking about, at Adobe, we're thinking about all the different ways in which data can be collected, and we want to make sure that as marketers, you're enabled to learn from it and optimize either your own site actions as well as activate, downstream through advertising and email and elsewhere. So today, I want to talk to you about sort of like three different pieces of that goal to have all of these different devices with data, collecting data, collecting it and enabling the marketers that you work with, the business users, the analysts, and the data scientists to take advantage and learn from that data. And then finally, some tips for how you can actually perform the analysis associated with the data collected from each of those different owned experiences that you have. And if you've joined any of my webinars before, you'll probably recognize that we have a really wide array of Adobe customers that are joining. We have customers that are maybe fresh out of college or fresh out of a different job that have never logged into an analytics tool before this year. And we have others that have been, using Adobe Analytics since it was called Omniture, Catalyst, or even Superstats, a few decades ago. And so I definitely want to make sure that there's plenty of content for both of those sets of groups as well as everyone in between, those that are comfortable in tools but still looking to learn. So I'll be sure to cover, again, some of the basics, some of the intermediates, and some of the advanced stuff so that everyone's able to get some value out of this. So let's start with what it looks like to actually deploy things. Within the Adobe and Adobe Experience Cloud world. And keep in mind that during this session, I'll be walking through a bunch of slides, but I also am excited to be jumping into Adobe Analytics and jumping into into my browser to show you things as well. So there's a lot more than just what you're seeing here in the slides, so don't worry. When it comes to deployment, for the mobile side of things, it's kind of obvious the best practice here is leveraging the Adobe SDK. Now, the SDK helps customers deploy Adobe Analytics, Adobe Target, Audience Manager, as well as the mobile core service across Apple, iOS, and Android, and Windows Phone for all those people that are on Windows, and ensuring that your apps are covered across each of those, leveraging an SDK. That SDK has automatic tracking that's built into it that we call our lifecycle metrics, and I'll give you a feel for what those look like. But once you're also deploying mobile core services through the SDK, in addition to Analytics, Target, and Audience Manager, you're going to gain access to things like the opportunity to optimize and do A/B testing, geofencing through location, as well as acquisition marketing links that I'll walk you through in just a minute. And finally, it enables you to have control over in-app and push messaging as well. So I mentioned lifecycle metrics. This is a list of all of the dimensions and metrics that you will begin capturing within just about 5 minutes of when you first deploy the SDK. You just simply tell the SDK what, a couple of basic things about who your company is and what report suite to send that data to, and automatically, as soon as that SDK is published into the App Store, you'll gain things like the number of launches, the days since the first use, the device name, which is even more granular than we're able to capture on the web, carrier name resolution, the total number of upgrades and launches, crashes, which is something I really like to keep an eye on. And you'll have all of this data in the mobile services UI, but you'll also have it in Analysis Workspace as well. And so let's see. So as we kind of go from there, in addition to lifecycle metrics, I mentioned acquisition links. And this is something that the mobile core service helps manage. And we kind of put together this little flow that explains how this works. And I'm sure that it's something that you've interacted with before on your phone. If you've ever received an email that had on your phone that you clicked through and ended up landing in an application rather than on the mobile web, that is how this kind of flow works. It starts with some logic of recognizing, well, did the user click from a mobile device or desktop? If it's not mobile, then obviously we're going to send the user over to the desktop web. If it is mobile, then the next piece of logic is, well, does the user have the app installed? If yes, then great. We can send that user into the app and even deep link them, which means that they're not just going to the home screen of the app, but maybe a specific piece of content that is contextual to the link that was actually clicked. If the user does not have the app, then you have the choice to set up the link to send the user to the mobile web, or instead send them directly to the App Store, where, again, as a roundabout, once it's installed, they'll be able to be deep linked directly to the content. And all of that is then going to be tied back to the campaign or to the tactic that actually drove that link. So these are links that are often used in paid and owned and earned locations. So you can identify the display banner that was clicked through, or a paid search link, or, as I mentioned, email, etc. Organic social or paid social, all of those fun things. Also with the mobile core service, you get access to be able to geo-target. So this means that you're able to create kind of geo-fences. Obviously within a mobile app, you've got a little more details around where in the world your users are. It's going to get even more granular, and you have the ability to inject points of interest, POIs, into the mobile core service so that you can start analyzing data there, and even set up a triggered experience to send push notifications or in-app messaging based on where the user is and if they're within the geofence that you've set up. Finally, I want to kind of walk through what it takes, what our process is for all of the ways in which data becomes accessible within Adobe Analytics and the Experience Cloud. So to do that, let's actually start all the way at the beginning. And I've already started talking a little bit about the SDK. And so the SDK is going to be your first point of data collection for the mobile world, as I mentioned. But of course, for the web, and you've got DTM, and you've also got Launch by Adobe, and you also have the data insertion API, which is yet another way to push data in real time into Adobe Analytics. From there, you're able to take advantage of dynamic variables. And dynamic variables are a way for just kind of to simplify some of your data collection, where you can copy data from one custom metric or one custom dimension to another. And that happens really quite automatically, and it's one of the first things that happens in terms of the data flow. In addition, using the SDK, you may be leveraging what we call dynamic variables or context data variables. And those context data variables are just really a friendly key name, and key value pair. So it's a name and the value associated with it. And you're able to leverage processing rules in order to turn and translate those context data variables into the more standard metrics and dimensions you're used to, events and evars and props and page name and site section and more. Another way to adjust data before it even gets into any report is by leveraging a Vista rule. And a Vista rule is something that's a little more powerful that happens on our back end that allows for data to be, for example, moved from one report suite to another, or to be tweaked in a way that maybe isn't possible within a processing rule. Now, after those four things occur, you're also going to have access to, if you're a subscriber of it, to have a direct real-time API access to that data set using Livestream. Livestream, as I mentioned, is an API-powered access to the data, and it comes incredibly fast, like 3 to 5 seconds after data collection, goes through those initial pre-processing pieces and allows for you to either send that data downstream to an activation engine, or maybe even like a real-time dashboard so that you can monitor big events and big changes or major campaigns that you have going on. Next up, the next piece happens is that data is started to tie back to the full visitor profile, so the history of that visitor. And then we start enabling and integrating the processing rules that are associated with the channels that drove that user to interact with your app in the first place. So those marketing channels are then created and become available within the interface. And we've finally sessionized all of those visits together and apply classifications so that you can retroactively update the values and variables within your tool set and make them available within Adobe Analytics. And of course, once all of that is completed, Adobe Analytics then makes it possible to send that data off to the rest of the Experience Cloud, Audience Manager, Target, Campaign, etc. for additional activation. So that's useful for mobile. Something to keep an eye on is dynamic variables and processing rules. I mentioned earlier how dynamic variables help kind of make your calls a little bit smaller. So it's something to consider as you're implementing Adobe Analytics through the SDK. And processing rules is one that's really important because that is how you translate context data variables into those evars and props, et cetera, that I mentioned. So that's how things work in terms of deployment for the web, or that's the best practice, or for mobile. For the web, best practice is to take advantage of Launch by Adobe. Launch is our next generation tag management tool set. This is not a webinar focused on Launch as much as I'd love to talk about it all day, every day. We have plenty of those going on, so keep an eye out for those if you haven't already heard about them. But the differentiator for Launch is really around having extensions that are built in-house at Adobe by our technology partners and by our agency partners to enhance the experience that our customers have when using that tag management system. And there's also open APIs and a familiar DTM rule builder and data element experience and more. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, you should have access to it today as long as you have access to the Experience Cloud, and it's fun to play around with and is really going to be next generation and a revolution in the way that the web is tagged. Of course, you can use any tag management system you like. My preference, of course, is leveraging the Adobe tools as a best practice. Now, all of that is going to look exactly the same when it comes to the analytics side of things, so I'm certainly not going to walk through this a second time. But the idea is just simply helping to enable all of these different pieces for your analytics data flow. One thing to keep an eye out for is on the web, since you have a much easier method for looking at the default way in which data is collected by sniffing the server call or looking at the beacon in your dev tools or within Charles, etc. I recommend against using processing rules and Vista rules. I find them to always be somewhat of a black box that maybe does exist and you can dig into them, but you always kind of forget about them. So whenever possible, leverage your tag management system to ensure that data is correct at the time of implementation. And then if it's not, then there's always the opportunity to leverage classifications to kind of clean up some data retroactively and historically on the back end. So across all of these different customers that you have, you've got a wealth of IDs associated with them. You've got the device ID, you've got a hashed login ID, an anonymous ID, in-app IDs, and all of these different ways that, when combined, give you a clearer picture of who your customer is. And the best recommendation I can give you is to begin to start thinking about how that's associated with something simple. What we have here is a pretty simple looking fruit. I call it in orange. Others on the call may have a much more normal accent than my Philly-based accent, which would be you're calling it in orange. And in addition, you may have other languages that you speak, and there's a ton of different ways to describe this very simple fruit that we all love and enjoy. And I want to use this kind of as a metaphor for collecting all of those IDs that define a consumer. So the same concept in that an analytics platform has an ID, and a testing and optimization platform has an ID, and a campaign and media buying, everyone has an ID, and that means that the audiences aren't going to be aligned either. And so if we're to take that example of all those different languages describing in orange, then extract that to each of these different platforms that we have on the Adobe side, the targeting platform, analytics, and campaign bid management, etc. The Experience Cloud ID service is what becomes your translator. So each of those different IDs ideally are passed into the Experience Cloud ID service as what we call a declared ID. So that would occur at login, or it would at an email click-through, any of those different times that an ID is exposed, pass that in as its own declared ID into the Experience Cloud ID service, so that it then can be associated with the single consumer profile and disseminated out to each of these different Adobe products. And of course, you can overlay that with a wealth of data as well. So you can start with creating those audiences from the different platforms. The Experience Cloud ID service, our People Core service, manages them all. Maybe you overlay leveraging what we call a customer attribute, where you're pushing in external or offline data that is associated with those IDs, and then it's getting shared back out to each of those different downstream actions, whether it's an advertisement platform or back into analytics for analysis or your DMP, etc. So what we've seen with customers that aren't doing this properly is that data and organizational silos are creating a really big problem when it comes to reporting and analysis. The web team has their own sets of reports that they use. The mobile app team has their own set, and they're not being shared either way. And then, of course, there's someone high up that says, hey, all I want is a dashboard, but I'm not going to analyze it or report on it or anything. I just need a dashboard. And so if there's no communication across those, then you're going to continue to split the natural organizational silos that exist within your company. So the recommendation is to take your data sets and combine them into a customer intelligence engine like Adobe Analytics in order to have it mixed together and then to share that data out to anyone that needs it in a both self-serving and proactive way. So the plan for doing this, let's get into a little bit more details around this. So the plan is to, whenever possible, leverage a global report suite. The global report suite is going to access data coming from your SDK, from mobile, from API, from voice or connected car, or any kind of IoT piece that isn't yet enabled for an SDK, as well as from the web, mobile web, desktop web, etc., using app measurement JS libraries. All of that goes into a global report suite where you're able to then define what your data governance is that's associated with dimensions and metrics and calculated metrics and segments and more. And it becomes your cross-device, cross-channel global report suite. You're able to apply customer attributes to it. You're able to apply classifications and more. And then the best recommendation I can give you is to start to take advantage of virtual report suites, where you apply a segment and some customization settings to that global report suite in order to align the data sets within those virtual report suites by device or by environment or by channel, all of these different ways that you want to slice and dice your data, and you've got a lot of options for doing that. So this is sort of what that architecture could look like. Maybe you've got a global report suite that captures data from your banking, your insurance, and your logged in portfolio sites, but you're able to leverage segments in order to create different virtual report suites associated with them. The great thing about virtual report suites is that there's no limit on the number of them that you can create. They're retroactive from the very first hit that the global report suite collected. And also you can you can edit them, so you can change the way that the segments are defined if necessary. You can also destroy them if you realize, you know what, this one doesn't make sense or the data doesn't align with the way that I expected. In addition, you're in a virtual report suite, you're able to take advantage of context-aware sessions, which means that on the fly, we're resessionizing the data based on visit timeout, for example. So you could have a visit definition that says, instead of using the standard 30 minutes of inactivity, that means a visit has ended, we're going to use 1 minute. We're going to for voice, or 5 minutes for a mobile app. Or, you know what, this is a particularly unique website, maybe the intranet of your site that you're trying to optimize for your own company. Then maybe you want to expand that to 24 hours, and it can be anywhere in between. And we have some customers that have set up some virtual report suites with different visit timeouts just to see how the data changes and see what aligns best within their business. And the idea there is to take advantage of these features to help better understand your customer base. You also have the ability to drag in any number of events that would essentially say, trigger a brand new visit based on any of these events. So for example, you could say anytime there's a new voice request, I want that to be a whole new visit. Or anytime there's a new marketing channel that comes in or SDOT campaign is set, trigger that as a new visit. And that can be really interesting for analyzing your data in a way that, that aligns with how you understand your customers. Another crazy important capability of virtual report suites is the ability to curate your components. So this means, first of all, you have the opportunity to exclude some components. So remember earlier, we were talking about the banking, insurance, and portfolio virtual report suites. If you have particular metrics or dimensions that are associated with insurance, you want to make sure that those aren't confusing the banking users that are logging into their virtual report suite. So that's what this curation component allows for. You also may be kind of duplicating the capabilities of some of your metrics. Maybe you have a metric called registrations, and on the banking site that means banking registrations or account opens, but in insurance that means registering for registering an email for content. And so in a virtual report suite, you can also rename the values of metrics and dimensions using component curation as well. So those are a couple of the different reasons to leverage virtual report suites, and it's a great way to ensure that different users within your organization have the right access to the right set of data in a way that they can understand. And so speaking of all of that, we want to then start to enable those users to analyze. And so I've got a bunch of different ways in which we have some best practices for enabling your marketers, enabling your business users and analysts and data scientists to use Adobe Analytics in the way that is best for them. And it starts with taking advantage of Analysis Workspace templates. So templates are a feature that we've had in the product for a little while. Just a few months ago, we released the ability for you to create custom templates that align more specifically with your business. So that's something as an administrator or a manager of the tool that we would recommend, is to look at ways to customize some templates so that users really have a startup place for their analysis. There's some really cool things that you can do with them. In addition, I highly, highly recommend setting up some very basic intelligent alerts. Alerts can be using anomaly detection to proactively inform you when spikes or dips occur within your data and just simply send you an email that, hey, did you know revenue increased by 200% here? You should take a look, and you can click through to a pre-built workspace. The nice thing there is that you also have the ability to say, you know what, I only want to be informed if page views, for example, drops all the way down to 0. If that happens, I want to sound the alarm, and I need to be made aware of that instantly. And so the way to stay on top of that could be perhaps to enable an SMS alert so that you perhaps are not in the office and you receive that text, uh-oh, there's a big problem. We need to focus on it. I've got that information faster than anyone else in the organization. You probably don't want to set up SMS on every single alert, so do keep an eye on how many times the alert would have triggered in the past, and you can do that by leveraging the alert preview. It'll show you how many times the alert that you created would have been triggered the last 7 or 30 days, etc. I'm also a really big fan of enabling your business users and your marketing users to empower them with a curated analysis workspace project. So when you're sharing projects, you may have noticed that there are probably dozens or even hundreds of dimensions and metrics and segments that are shared over. And this helps make that experience for those newer users a little more curated, a little more easy, a little less overwhelming. And it's a really good way to share that out. And speaking of sharing, if you put your reading glasses on, you can probably see that in the recipient's share area there, I've enabled the ability to share to a few different groups, the digital agency, quality assurance team, and the operations team. And the really nice thing about sharing workspaces to those groups in that way is that as employees come and go from those groups, it's aligned specifically within your user management. So if someone leaves the company from the QA team, then they'll no longer have access to it. Or if someone new joins the company in the operations team, they'll automatically have access to this as soon as your user management is updated. Now, one additional recommendation I have for a fun tip for curating and sharing is I like to actually kind of pre-fill out a segment comparison for customers. In order to kind of give them a little bit of a carrot that says, hey, did you know that you could consider comparing tablet users to mobile phone users? And maybe that's something that will help enable and drive better usage of the tool set rather than simply asking and picking up the phone every 5 minutes of, hey, Eric, did you know that, can you tell me more about how these two segments differ? So that's one way that you can just kind of hit save and share that so that it's just simply one click and your users will be able to start leveraging data science. Something else that I really love within Workspace, especially when sharing to maybe newer users, is leveraging text fields and text formatting and links in order to lead your internal customers to insights. So you may have heard about the Hack the Bracket campaign that we had going during March. We loaded up, I think, the year's worth of data, the season's worth of data into Analysis Workspace from all of the NCAA teams, and then we shared that out to the broader audience. And we realized that there were a bunch of new users to Analysis Workspace that maybe never logged into the tool, and we wanted to give them that kind of curated experience and contextual view. So let me actually show you what that looks like so that you don't have to look at the screen here. It's a really great template that I'm a fan of. I've pulled it up here in my browser where I have the ability to just kind of show you a few different things. So at the top, just a nice friendly explanation of what's going on, what the project includes, what the data set it is, how you can use it, and even a few links to some examples of what you could use to get started. Maybe just click this video, which is a walkthrough of how to use this particular workspace. Similarly, you can also, if you already know how to use it and you want to do something more advanced, maybe link to a more advanced template that these users can get in, really sink their teeth into as well. And then you can kind of start from scratch or do a team analysis, etc. But there's even more really cool things that I want to point out here. First of all, you'll notice across every single table here, there's some instructions associated with this. And you can take this and start to incorporate this into the workspaces that you're using for both mobile apps and for web analysis, where you can give some context as to what the data is, or some recommendations for how the end user should be leveraging the visualization that you have. And we've even leveraged, some really simple, just kind of formatting to make it even easier. It's like, oh, you're going to grab a dimension. We colored that orange. It's orange over here. We've got green over here. That must mean we're pulling in some metrics, etc. And so really, really easy ways to make life simpler for your individual end users of Analysis Workspace. So it's a great way that I thought was worth sharing of taking advantage of text, which is accessible over here in visualizations. If you've never been there before, you can just simply drag in a text box and edit it to your heart's content, as well as links, so that when you're in there, you can just kind of highlight anything you need and maybe change the formatting or links, etc. So lots of really nice, simple capabilities that will help ensure democratization across your organization. So with that hopefully was a good sort of maybe that basic to intermediate view of how you can start enabling your analysts. I want to get into some more advanced stuff. So for those advanced users out there, think about how you can calculate those metrics and segment those segments. And so as you're building out your calculated metrics and segments, look for opportunities to pre-build them, share them, approve them, tag them, and make sure that your users know what they're getting into once they're interacting with them. So I've got some super powered examples for you. So the first one is maybe a little simpler. This is focused specifically for the mobile app analysis for very simply crash rate. This is one that I love to dig into and compare to the different device types that you have, the device names, what are the different app versions, new versus returning, what are the different pages users are crashing on. There's tons of ways to get this very simple metric, some value out of it and turn it into something actionable. In addition, here's one that you may have seen before that we've shared around content velocity, where the idea is taking advantage of not just simply page views per visit, which is one of those standards of web analysis and mobile analysis, but also thinking about, well, how many page views downstream or screen views downstream is this content driving? And that's where enabling a different allocation method for page views becomes important. You can see here we're actually converting that to visit participation for page views so that we're able to create this content velocity metric. And I like using that in order to segment it by device type or app version, retention, new versus returning, or maybe a bunch of different retention-based segments, the different page types, what page types are driving content velocity downstream, and I really like visualizing it in a scatter chart that has maybe content velocity along the x-axis, and across the y-axis you've got total page views, and you can see and find different quadrants of interesting content. Another standard metric that you've probably used before but maybe haven't thought about in terms of Adobe Analytics is leveraging average order value. If you're capturing revenue in your product, it's a great way to identify whether average order value is being trended in the right direction. Is it going up? Is it going down? I really like to apply conditional formatting to average order value when breaking it out by product type or product or the marketing channels that are driving purchases. And again, scatter charts are great too. Next up, this one's even more advanced, is taking advantage of our cumulative average function, which is an advanced function in calculated metrics. It allows for you to create really a 7-day or any number of day moving average. This is really valuable for those metrics that kind of have really crazy, like a heart scan style trend that perhaps needs a little bit of smoothing applied. And so this very smooth metric will help enable that. So we can say, instead of some crazy looking CT scan, you can see, all of this kind of fun stuff broken out, and when you trend it is probably the best place to apply your 7-day moving average, as well as, of course, applying different segments to it. I'm also a fan of leveraging the approximate count distinct function, which again is an advanced function in calculated metrics that you can pull login name or CRM ID or even marketing channel or page type and see how many different unique values within that dimension are being accessed, and then tie that to other dimensions and other segments to learn from it. It's interesting to even trend over time, especially if you're curious, well, is my number of logged in users going up or is it going down? And is it heading in the right way? So some really valuable stuff there too. So for those calculated metrics, hopefully you got some value there. I also want to share over some valuable segments that you may not already know that you already have access to. And so if you've ever opened the recency, frequency, and loyalty template, especially recently, you'll have noticed that there's actually some pre-built segments that are hiding behind this recency table here. So all you need to do is just simply click Show Data Source, and you'll have a bunch of new segments that are pre-built for 0 days since last visit, or 1 to 5 days since last visit, 6 to 10, etc. And so it kind of pre-builds some segments for you, and all you would need to do is open them, edit them, and save them as public, and you can then take advantage of those already. What I would recommend is analyzing your cohorts first. So recognizing, are these the right buckets for me to be analyzing, or maybe it's something smaller or something bigger that's worth digging into. And that's going to be really valuable, especially in the mobile app world where it's so easy to close the app and never open it again, maybe file it away in some folder that the user never comes back to, or perhaps just seeing if the app was deleted in the first place. So lots of really valuable segments that are already accessible to you in this template. Another mobile app-focused segment that I like to dig into is leveraging device name. And so we have some further details around device types that becomes available, especially when it comes to Apple devices, because they don't allow, we're unable to see which iPhone types or iPad types, etc., are being used. And so you can see iPhone 10,2, 10,3, 10,5, etc. And what that means is it's actually the device ID associated with these. In order for you to translate them, I actually created a couple of bit.ly links here for you, iPhone IDs and Samsung IDs. And so I'll actually open those up in just a second here so you can see them. And so iPhone IDs, all it is just like a little lookup table that gives you a list of all of the different model identifiers. We can see 10.5 is the iPhone 8 Plus in the US here. And similarly, Samsung IDs as well. You're going to have all of the different IDs associated. Now, that is certainly going to be valuable to you when you're creating segments. And these segments are going to be leveraging, I like to create 3. I like to do one that is the latest or the current gen, so that's going to be your iPhone 8 and 8 Plus and 10 and your Samsung Galaxy S9 and S9 Plus. You can also do recent, so maybe last year's, as well as old devices so that are maybe 2 years old. And it's a really, really valuable way to dig into your data by taking a look at conversion rates or crash rates, or even breaking out your different prescribed funnels or your fallout to see how things differ depending on how old the device is, because you may actually find opportunities to optimize the experience for older devices that maybe are getting bogged down or crashing more, etc. I have a few retention-based segments that I'd like to share to you, and these come courtesy of one of our analytics rock stars, Audrey Salerno from Cars.com. The first is one that she calls single-page visitors, where it's very simple. It's the visitor, not the visit. The visitor only had one visit and only had one page view. This is a really interesting retention segment because you can see maybe what was the device type, or were they in the app or the web? What is this going up or is this going down, the number of visitors doing this? What marketing channels are driving these bouncing for the end of time visitors. Another awesome retention segment from Audrey is single visit, multi-page visitors, where the visitors only had one visit, but that visit did have multiple page views. So they didn't bounce. They saw multiple page views, but it's worth analyzing maybe by by the device type, their experience, etc., and learning more about, well, why did they not come back? And maybe it was good news. Maybe they accomplished what they were trying to do and never came back because they didn't need to. Or did they bump into, a help page that sent them down a rabbit hole that they were like, you know what, I'm never coming back to this website again. The last of the Magic 3 retention segments from Audrey over at cars.com is probably the simplest. And this is your multi-visit, your repeat visitors, where you can identify visitors that have more than a single visit number as well. It's really interesting to analyze, again, by all those different dimensions and even to compare to the other two retention segments. So let's dig into actually performing some analysis. And so this is once you've got all of that deployment and the enablement pieces set up, I want you to think about, well, what are my goals? And this is one that is so obvious, but I wanted to really call it out here by taking over your entire screen and saying, what's the point of having a goal if you don't have a plan? And so what I'd like you to do is dust off that measurement plan. And that measurement plan should be aligned across all digital experiences. So that's mobile, that's voice, that's car, that's web, that's mobile web, everything. And you're just going to simply create these 4 different concepts of objectives and goals and KPIs and targets. I've created a few here already where my objective is to teach the world about the awesomeness that is Analysis Workspace. The marketing tactic or my goal is to create awareness. My KPIs are webinar registrations per visitor, average time spent on tutorial videos, and of course, high fives at Summit per webinar that I have. And of course, I've aligned some targets for each of these, and I like to break out targets into really 3 different pieces. The really happy side of things, like fine, okay, life is okay, and then the unhappy region where you're face palming. So once you've dusted off that measurement plan, updated it for the latest and greatest, and of course we could do an entire hour on just the steps for doing that. Let's dig into what you're going to do once you've got that measurement plan in play. And I want you to actually align a workspace for every goal that you have. And we're going to align that workspace into 3 panels. Those panels are going to be summary, prescribed path, and exploratory analysis. So I've created one. So let me actually dig into and show you what it actually looks like. So here I am in my project awareness workspace, and I've created a few different panels just as I described. So starting with summary here at the top, you can see the total number of my KPIs. You can see the summary. You can see my registrations last month compared to previous. And when it comes to KPIs, you may have noticed I really much prefer using rate-based metrics. Just simply a summary is a lot harder, but I do really appreciate having that as a context. So that's why I like to put them side by side here. Beneath those 3 summaries, I then like to start thinking about, well, what are my registrations over time? Is that heading in the right direction? Is it trending? And of course, since it's a trend here in Workspace, I'll have anomalies that are proactively informing me about spikes or dips in my data. If I need to and I see one, it's a great starting place for kicking off a contribution analysis. So that's going to be the top portion of my summary. Then I want to start thinking about, well, what are the marketing channels that are driving my KPI of registration conversion rate? So I like to align first touch channel, last touch channel, and give it a little bit of context so I can see visits. I even like to apply visits and sort it by visits, and then apply some conditional formatting so I can see, and then quickly identify, oh, there's a problem here. There's a lot of visits coming from email, but they're not driving a lot of registrations. Now that may sound like bad news, but that's probably not that big a deal since they're coming from email. They're already registered. So really easy way to quickly identify your data set there. And then finally, the last piece of the summary panel, is identifying those key segments, the ones that are in my measurement plan that I'm going to want to use to slice and dice my data. And so I've got my 3 retention-based rockstar segments from Audrey, as well as just simply breaking out website versus mobile app, and then, of course, my visits and my KPI. So a really good jumping off point for your analysis, that summary panel. Beneath that, I've got my prescribed path. And when we're talking prescriptions, I like to start thinking about the fallout. So the fallout is where you are identifying, this is how I want my users to be using the website. When they come to the website, when they come to the app, I want them to start on the home page. I want them to then eventually get to my account registration page and then the account registration confirmation page. And of course, I'll want to break that out across each of my different segments so that I can learn, more in a more granular sense how users are falling in and falling out. Speaking of falling in and falling out, it wouldn't be a webinar by me if you didn't hear me say the words right-click. So fallout is all about right-click. There's so much more than just this graph that you're looking at. So right-click wherever you are when you want to learn some more in order to trend, in order to break down the fall through and the fall out. That's something I love to do, is breaking down the fall out. Is so maybe users got to the registration form, but they fell out before confirming. So I'll want to break that out by what was the marketing channel, what was the device type, maybe what was the app version, and maybe some app versions there's a problem that can be discovered in that way. So tons of value, of course, with right-clicking. And then the second piece, the second 2 pieces of the prescribed area is starting to think about Venn diagrams and how your key segments overlap and where there are opportunities to learn from that. I've got just simply my multi-visit repeat visitors overlaid with website and overlaid again with mobile app. Now, the visualization may only be somewhat useful to you, which is where I love to click on the dot here and select Show Data Source. So then I can really dig in and see, okay, well, here's my unique visitors, which is the metric, and my 2 segments and the overlay. And if I'm really curious, then I can begin digging into it, right-clicking and trending and creating calculated metrics and all sorts of fun stuff. So highly recommend digging into that data source as well. And then finally, we've got our exploratory analysis. And when we're talking exploratory analysis, the visualization probably most associated there is going to be your flow visualization, where you can see how users are going from one page or one screen to the next and to the next and to the next. Don't forget the ability to drag and drop and change your dimension on the fly. So we can see instead maybe what are the page types the users from search results are going to, and then maybe I dig in further from there. And of course, right-click to your heart's extent from any of this as you're finding interesting nuggets about your data. The other piece around exploratory analysis, I mentioned this earlier, is thinking about cohorts, trying to think about how many days or minutes or weeks or months, et cetera, it takes from one metric to the next. So from the very first visit, this is launch and visit number 1, how long does it take before the user actually logs in for the first time? And so we can see, we can see all sorts of interesting trends here. We can actually see it looks like there was some kind of action that occurred right around April 8th that maybe was driving users to log in to this particular mobile app. So I can see, 7 days, really 6-7 days after the first, 6 days after the second, 5 days after the third, etc., ends up pointing directly at the 8th. So that is something that maybe I want to right-click and create a segment in order to dig further into it. So the last piece that I like to build into my exploratory analysis is, and I mentioned this earlier, is starting to think about segment comparison. So this is one where you're comparing 2 segments. You're leveraging data science and some machine learning jobs to do a comparison and contrast of those 2 segments. And so for these 2, I did those 2 retention segments of those that have been to the website just once and had multiple pages versus those that have been to the web or mobile app multiple times. And it looks like my Wi-Fi is a little slow. I ran this earlier. It took about 15 seconds. You'll see a comparison of what differentiates between those two segments. That seems to be speeding along. It'll give me a list of what the metrics, what the dimensions, and what the segments are that truly differentiate between those two segments. That can be really valuable as you can learn, the segment that where users are coming back and back and back maybe to my mobile app. Those are my repeat visitors. I want to learn, well, what were the metrics and dimensions that were driving them? And that's where, of course, between these two, we're not going to have any overlap. But maybe we recognize, oh, you know what, users that are performing a search or users that are accessing a product detail view have a much higher propensity to return back to this experience. And so maybe I'll be able to take that information and dig into it further and recognize that there's an opportunity to optimize the mobile app or the web to drive more product detail views. So that is everything I wanted to show, and somehow I managed to do it all within, if we look at the clock, 55 minutes. There's one other announcement to make in that the Analytics Rockstar is coming back. It's coming to a city near you. We currently have these 5 dates locked in. So that's Dallas, Atlanta, LA, Chicago, and New York. And we're calling it the Analytics Insider Tours. We're doing even more than just Rockstar. We're having customers present. We're having Adobe product people and consultants present. We've got a Genius Bar. We've got all sorts of really cool stuff. So if you happen to have a QR code reader handy, go ahead and take a picture of that QR code. If you're a Bitly fan like I am, go ahead and just do bit.ly/insider tour, and it'll take you to the sign-up page. So I hope to see you at one of those locations, and I want to take the last 4 or 5 minutes that we have here. I'm sure Russ on our team has been working furiously to answer the questions coming in from the chat pod, but if you were unable to answer them there, or you want to reach out to me directly, definitely don't hesitate to reach out over Twitter or the Measure Slack, and also, of course, the community forum. So I'll head on over into the Q&A chat pod and see if there's anything that was too difficult for Russ to answer. And of course, Russ's brilliant mind was way beyond where we expected it to be. And so all questions seem to be answered except for a couple. Let's see. So there's one that says, can the SDK key off of Firebase Analytics events? So while we're doing this, let's actually switch on over to the poll so that as users are listening, they have the opportunity to also provide us with some feedback. Please do provide feedback. It's the best way that we can ensure that the content is aligned with what you're looking to learn. And so let's see. So can the SDK key off of Firebase Analytics events? The word key is a little confusing to me. Firebase is generally going to send data on over to Google Analytics, but you certainly, okay, I see. So you're looking to have it listen for events. Honestly, I'm not quite sure, Enrique. I'm going to take that as a follow-up and make sure that we get you the answer there as well. Next up, let's see, there was a mention at Summit about updating the SDK to be able to control whether individual services like Analytics can be turned off or on. Looking for some details on the dates for that. So I know that today there are some ways to remove completely the code from the other solutions. If, for example, you're only looking to deploy Analytics and you know for certain you're never going to be deploying Audience Manager, then there is the ability to remove that today. But in terms of making it a little bit more seamless rather than just simply deleting code, I'm not quite sure on the timing of that. I believe it's going to be later this year. We've got some really powerful new capabilities coming to the SDK that'll really blow your mind, Dan. But we will certainly share that as well. Let's see. I'm seeing a note that bit.ly/insider tour didn't work. It's working for me. Make sure that Insider Tour, the capital I and capital T in Insider Tour. Next up, next question from our national winner of the Analytics Rockstar, Megan Powers from CarMax.com. Not to call you out at all, Megan, but it's great to see your question. When you break out a fallout report, it shows you the other pages they go to instead of the page that you want. Really love to see also what percentage of those who fall out just exit our site rather than going to another page. So let's see. So the way that I've been doing that, Megan, so if you're looking to identify, learn more about your fall out or your instead of fall through, I like to do what you're doing. Do that breakout and then look at the segment that's automatically created by that new visualization that's created by the breakout or the fallout, and then you can edit that segment to your heart's content. And that's really where I start looking at, applying that segment to a flow visualization and looking backwards through the pages, for example. So that's one way that I like to handle that as well.